Hi, everyone, and thanks again for joining me for another episode of the Gaudium et Spes 22 podcast, both on YouTube and then Podbean podcast, which you can get on Spotify, Apple, and Amazon Music. I always sound like so impressive when I say crap like that. You know, I sound like Joe Rogan on here. You can get me on Spotify and Apple. I don't even know what Spotify is. It sounds like something you'd want to get off your rug more than I don't really. Oh, now they'll probably boot me up.
Ingratiate yourself.
Now, yeah, exactly. Now watch Spotify immediately remove me from, since I'm sure their flying monkeys are out investigating every errant word on their platform. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. I'm excited today. We're getting away from inside baseball ecclesiastical church chat, and we're going to start talking some dense theology again today. So for those fans of the dense theology, here you go. Today's topic is the historical mediation of being. So that's pretty dense theological stuff right there. What is that? What does it mean? Why is it important? Joining me today, as always, it seems like my former colleague at DeSales University, the one, the only, the maladroit misanthrope, Dr. Rodney Howsare. Actually, you once called me the maladroit misanthrope, and I think it's questionable as to which one of us is more. I'm more of the misanthrope. That's true, but the maladroit, I don't know.
I think I have that, yeah.
But Rodney is the Rodney is the chair of the Department of Theology at the one and only DeSales University. Also joining us, and Rachel, don't cry sexism or something here. I'm going to save you for last. All right, is Dr. Adrian Walker, who teaches at St. Patrick's Seminary in Menlo Park, California. Known Adrian for years, former teacher at the John Paul II Institute in Washington, Catholic University of America, and just an all-around great guy and a genius. Sheer genius, raw genius. The genius in the house. All right. And finally,
my favorite introduction for Adrian is International Man of Mystery.
International Man of baby. Yeah. International Man of Mystery. Yeah. Who's his mini-me? Oh, that would be Dr. Evil. That would be Dr. Evil. I'm the baldest one here, so I'm probably the biggest candidate for Dr. Evil. I need to find a mini-me. You complete me. Rachel Coleman, Dr. Rachel Coleman. Former student of ours at DeSales University, but got her PhD at the JP2 Institute of Washington, D.C. Now teaches in Massachusetts, up there at Assumption, right?
Yep.
Is it Assumption College or University?
University.
So
there are no more colleges.
Yeah, that's right. There are no more colleges anymore. Well, some actually, I think, have retained college. Hey, Rodney, isn't Muhlenberg College in the Lehigh Valley still college, or is it Muhlenberg University?
If you have a really big endowment, you keep the name.
You keep the college name.
Yeah.
Like Boston College.
If you don't, you have to pretend that you're something you're not, and therefore you call yourself a university.
Yeah. Well, one thing that needs to
get me in trouble. I don't have tenure yet. So.
Yeah, well, nobody cares. So, because, and I don't mean that personally. I mean it in the sense I was about to say one of the things that someday I think the four of us need to get together to talk about is university education in general and Catholic university education in particular. Because lately, now that it no longer pays my bills, I am free to say that I burn the house down. I hope they all rot. They're all a pile of overpriced monstrosities, that pretentious and so on. But nevertheless, that's a rather extreme view, I know. But let's get on with the historical mediation of being. So I warned Dr. Walker in advance, Adrian, that I was going to pick on him first, because quite frankly, this is one of those times when I'm interviewing people, or this is more of a conversation than an interview, where your humble host here is not exactly completely up to speed on the topic. So I'm going to, but then we got grand admissions from everybody beforehand that neither is anybody else on the panel.
That's right.
up to speed on the topic. So that's a caveat to listeners to please be kind as you're listening to us. But anyway, I'm going to turn it over to Adrian. All joking aside, this actually is a very serious topic. We've been wanting to talk about this for several months, and I had to go to Rome, and so that got canceled, and blah blah blah. And so here we are. So Adrian, get us started here. What do we mean when we say the historical mediation of being, and why is it important?
Well, I suppose part of the purpose of our conversation is to answer the first part of the question. What does it mean?
Yeah.
So I won't start off by saying what I think it means. I'm just going to sort of point towards the ballpark in which we'll be playing, so that it's maybe a little bit clearer what we're talking about, sort of roughly speaking. And then maybe in that context, we can say something about the importance of the topic, and that should be enough to get us started.
Absolutely.
So I guess maybe you could say that what we're talking about is a kind of issue in, say, fundamental theology, right? So the kind of part of theology that is about reflecting on the nature and sources of revelation, among other things, right? That's not all fundamental theology is about, but that's part of what fundamental theology is about. And it seems to me that there's sort of kind of off and on, maybe in 20th century thought, and probably before it, and it's still kind of going on today. There's kind of a debate about sort of how we know God through his self-revelation, right? And so and it seems like the kind of two poles in the debate would be like a more historical pole and a more kind of sort of essential conceptual pole, right? So the essential conceptual pole would be sort of about the importance of as it were, eternal truths that can be grasped in essentially kind of valid and so irreformable propositions, right? That would be one pole. And it does seem like God's self-revelation would have to include something like that, right? God tells us about himself and so on. And then the other pole is sort of is as I say, the historical pole, and it kind of has to do with the fact that God makes himself known via a kind of personal disclosure of himself that happens in time and space, right? That happens through events and so forth. And in a way, the question is sort of like, how do those two things go together, right? And you can it seems to me that you could sort of wrongly emphasize one or the other, right? You could sort of emphasize for example, the historical pole in such a way that you ended up with a kind of modernism, right? The sort of idea that there's basically the historical pole, which gets identified with a kind of sort of processual flux, becomes almost it sort of absorbs any sense of kind of divine transcendence communicating itself, right? But then there's also maybe a way of wrongly emphasizing the kind of conceptual propositional dimension, where basically revelation just becomes about God telling us stuff that's true, but his own involvement in our time and space, his own sort of historical action basically becomes irrelevant, so that any sense that God revealing himself and us responding has to do with a kind of covenantal, dialogical, covenantal kind of relationship between him and us just sort of
Right.
disappears from the horizon. So that's kind of a really rough. I mean, I'm sort of coming to it a bit cold. I should have spent a little bit more time kind of preparing.
Well, I guess we all should have, but no, I thought that was great. And immediately, because so that it really does lay out the parameters of it is in saying, describing what we're talking about here, that kind of answers already why it's important.
Yeah.
And it's important because it's really, I don't want to get into ecclesiastical issues today, but it really hits upon some major controversies that are going on in the church today about how do we discern the movement of the Holy Spirit in the church vis-a-vis the truth of revelation, in terms of what things are binding, what things are not, what things are fungible, changeable, what things are not. And so this is the burning question. Now, I think part of the problem, and then I'll turn it over to the other guys, in listening to your description, is that you have rightly made, I think, that sort of distinction that we've all made since Blondel, between the transcendent propositional element here and the sort of historical unfolding, more subjective element. The difficulty arises, of course, because even the conceptual element is historical. And is rooted in that same flux of history, that same time. So there has to be, in a sense, this part of the conceptual element that in some way does transcend that flux. And so the manner of speaking of that transcendence is terribly important here. So I think that ultimately there's a connection between the nature of revelation as self-disclosure of God and revelation as propositional, because even the propositional part has got a theodramatic moment. It's got a theodramatic structure to it.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. So you could sort of say that one of the issues that's in play here concerns what we mean by development of doctrine, right? I mean, because it does seem like there's certainly in the life of the church, there's a kind of unfolding of understanding of the deposit of faith, say, right? And so the question is sort of, so one question would be, is it really an unfolding, which I think it is, or is it just a kind of essentially series of changes, that aren't so much unfolding anything as just providing the occasion for people to kind of come up with new ideas or new claims that may or may not have anything intrinsic to do with the faith, right? So that's one question. But then even assuming, which I think is the correct way of thinking about it, that there is an unfolding. I mean, it's still true that the unfolding happens in time and space, and you can see that unfolding not only in the life of the church, sort of after the deposit of faith is kind of given over once and for all, when after revelation is over with the death of the last apostle. But you can also see it sort of, for example, in the New Testament itself, right? You can see just the very fact that the New Testament wasn't written down right away, that it was these kind of began to be composed, maybe a couple of decades or something after, the death and resurrection of Christ. So so this unfolding happens in time and space. And so the question is, is that significant? Is it just a kind of accidental occasion for the truth to kind of shine more brightly, but aside from it providing that occasion, it means nothing? Does it have a more kind of intrinsic or constitutive significance for how we understand truth, without that compromising the fact that there is an original deposit of faith that is a kind of valid self-disclosure of God as he is in himself to us, right? That would be sort of another a way of kind of refining the question a little bit.
Yeah, and it's a very important question because, I mean, as I often say to people, the kingdom of God is like a mustard seed that then grows into this, big thing. The fact of the matter is that the mustard shrub tree doesn't look anything like the damn seed,
right?
And so you'd be foolish, to think, well, obviously this didn't come from a seed. Well, in fact, it did.
Right.
And so this gives the lie to all sort of genetic fallacies and also all forms of ecclesial primitivism. Now that then, though, immediately leads to the question of what then constitutes, because obviously there's going to be, it's not just change for the sake of change. There's growth, there's an unfolding, there's an organic development. And yet what does organically develop? Because you hear this all the time. I don't see this in the Bible. I don't see that in the Bible. Or, the church of today doesn't look anything like St. Peter wouldn't recognize the church of today. Well, actually, I think he would. But in some ways it's kind of beside the point. So anyway, these are all great questions. I'm going to turn it over to the other two, Rachel, Rodney. Let's start with Rachel and then we'll go down to Rodney.
Well, I mean, yeah, I think just to it's just kind of interesting, right? Like, I mean, the genesis of this conversation was actually I think the first podcast the three of you did together. Right. And just to lay, Adrian, like you said in that one, like, it seems like the way people treat history and the historical mediation of being, it's as if almost it would be somehow like if, we were created and then somehow like, all of our experiences in our life, or all the knowledge that we gained through experience in our life could be transferred into us somehow, like a file drop.
Right.
And not actually live that life,
right?
Would still be the same, right? It would effectively be the same, which I mean simply can't be the case, right? So the interesting thing here, I mean, one of the things Ferdinand Ulrich says, who you're all familiar with, like he always talks about how the gift of creation, like everything has to be given in the beginning in order for it to unfold. So, I mean, the seed, analogy is really good one here, right? Like if the seed is somehow missing or lacking something, you can put it in the best environment possible, give it all the water and sun necessary, but like nothing's going to happen actually, right? And so the fullness of the plant, so to speak, or the fullness of the gift really has to be there in the beginning, not as a limit to the creature, right? Like, because I think sometimes we think of it as almost like because we have a bad understanding of freedom, we think, oh, everything being given in the beginning somehow limits us. But actually, like if we think about it again with the analogy of the seed, to be given sort of given the capacity to enact ourselves and unfold everything is not a limit. It is actually the prerequisite for freedom itself, actually. Like, so in order for creation to be free, right, God actually does have to sort of give everything like from the beginning, like the entire capacity to be and to unfold oneself. And I think, again, we think of it as a constraint a lot of times, that like because we think of freedom as sort of like this wide open, non telos directed thing, right? We think of being given everything as a constraint when it's actually the exact opposite.
Can I just a quick parenthesis? That's really great, Rachel, and I mean it brings up for me, a related point, which is that, you know, you'll see a plant or an animal be faithful to its developmental path precisely by responding to and mastering circumstances, events, contingencies that are sort of beyond its control, right? So, you know, all of the things that sort of happen in the history of the church, as it were, from the outside, which call forth a response, can, if you're not looking at things deeply enough, be interpreted as a kind of essentially deterministic story in which the church just becomes the kind of passive product of these things that have happened to it. Whereas actually, if we are talking about, you know, the mustard seed unfolding itself, which is intended by Jesus Christ. I mean, the Lord says that the kingdom of God is going to be like that the church is going to be like that. It's founded to be like that. Then you can expect that, yes, there are all kinds of things that are going to happen, as it were, from the outside, from the inside. Again, those things are actually accounted for. We see that in the Gospels, the way that Christ speaks about, you know, coming persecutions and all of the rest of it. So, but in other words, it's like all of those things are indeed going to happen. And then in this theodramatic way that Larry was talking about, the church is going to be faithful to its developmental path. So it's sort of like taking account of and even using these events as an occasion to kind of unfold itself further, right? So there doesn't have to be any contradiction between, you know, the craziness of history, which is sort of what historians seem to focus on most of all, and a kind of basic fidelity forward, which is also, you know, as Kierkegaard and Ulrich say, a kind of repetition backwards towards the origin.
Yeah. And exactly. And by the theodramatic element, I'm thinking here of Balthasar's, you know, Theologic, you know, the end of the trilogy, and the explication of that you find in people like David C. Schindler's, I guess it was his doctoral dissertation, but it's a great book,
right?
You know, the theodramatic structure of truth.
Yeah,
that's and you're sort of hinting at that. But before I go on with that, and I thought what Rachel said was great too, and I had something I want to say about that from an article I just read in the Thomist, which is fantastic. Rodney, you go ahead.
No, I can only just kind of, you know, pick up some loose pieces of what you all have already kind of said so beautifully. But if you think, you can think about it both in terms of sort of the church, right, mustard seed and all that, but also in terms of like an individual's mission, right? So and kind of what Rachel was saying about, I mean, that passage in Paul that comes to mind always is, you know, sort of we are his workmanship created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which he prepared for us in advance, right? And then I think in the context, maybe it's in the same passage. I'm no longer a Protestant, so I can't remember, but it's something along the lines of set your minds above where Christ is seated at the right hand of the Father.
Colossians,
because you have died and your life is hidden there, right? So on the one hand, it's exactly what you just said, Adrian. It's already there from the beginning,
right?
The mission that we have, but kind of on the other hand, because we are creatures who are becoming, you know, we're creatures from dust and all of that. We have to live out that mission, and the various things that happen to us in history aren't just therefore sort of just one darn thing after another or whatever. They literally give rise in our individual cases to us discovering our mission and either living up to it or not living up to it. Right. So sometimes like even like really difficult things that we go through, in fact, usually really difficult things that we can throw through are precisely the things that might up. I mean, if you think of Frodo, you know, sitting in his shire eating his cheese and drinking his beer, I mean, that's a good life. And then there's this crisis that he's like, oh, I discovered my mission. And just to quickly tie this in with like current church events, which we were talking about just a little bit before, some of the bishops who are responding to more troubling things said by other bishops, it's almost like finally they're finding their voices, and of course it's their mission to defend the faith and to say things that are going to make them unpopular, and it takes an act of courage, et cetera, because who knows what might happen. But that's almost like it takes these crises in a way, not that the crises are good in themselves, of course, but it takes these kind of crises to help us discover what was there from the beginning, et cetera. And I think that shed some light on some of this.
Yeah, if I could just say, this is all great, and I mean what you're saying underlines, among other things, the importance of seeing the story of the church, the story of our individual lives, the story of humanity as a providentially crafted story in which we participate. And our participation does seem to unite these aspects of sort of having to deal with things that come from the outside that are beyond our control. Some of those things are unpleasant, but that doesn't mean that having to deal with things outside of our control is a bad thing. On the contrary, it's a way of it's an opportunity for us, a God-given opportunity, literally, to basically get out of our heads, and then so there's that, and then on the other side, to because it's an opportunity to get out of our heads, it's also an opportunity to rise to the occasion, right? And in a Christian economy, rising to the occasion is a matter of trust, but it's also a matter of a kind of spiritedness, a kind of theodramatic engagement. And I really do think that, as you say, and this is completely in line with what Rachel was saying at the beginning, that the sort of trustful theodramatic engagement with these unforeseen things that draw us out of ourselves becomes the opportunity for laying hold of, in a sort of new and at the same time faithful way of what was there from the beginning, but there not as Rachel was saying, not as a kind of a fixed fate, but precisely as something whose very initial givenness sort of requires this kind of unfolding, because it's not just dropped into a void, but it's sort of covenantally given.
And I'm reminded, and I want to come back to Rachel here in a second. So don't despair, Rachel. I saw you writing furiously over there, so you must have tons to say. So I want to avail ourselves of your wisdom here. But I am reminded in this conversation of Blondel's famous statement that he defined truth as the conformity of the mind to life, rather than the conformity. And of course, he took it on the chin for that. Oh,
right.
There you go, you Hegelian troglodyte, for modernist pig. But this, it seems to me, is exactly what Blondel was saying. That truth, truth cannot simply be reduced down to a set of timeless ahistorical abstractions in the realm of the concept. Though those are very, very important, of course. I'm not just paying lip service to that. But this dynamical element of truth is precisely something that had been ignored in the church for a long time. And that's exactly what then allowed the modernists to co-opt the conversation, precisely because it had not been attended to properly. And then the second thing I want to say too, before I pass this off to Rachel, is one of the things too that we know from, and Rodney, I love your comments about mission, because one of the things we know about in our personal lives about living our missions is that our lives are not linear, It's more like an Ariadne's thread weaving its way through a labyrinth more than it is a straight line linear development of A to Z. Now, once in a while, you see that in a person. At age 3, they're already composing concertos on their piano, and then all of a sudden they're a prodigy by the time they're 5 and stuff like that. Okay, fine. Those nerds notwithstanding. The fact is, most of our lives we write straight with crooked lines, and that means that that as life unfolds, even in our own lives, there are going to be scars. There are going to be scars that are redeemed, scars that are transformed, but scars that remain, and deformities and distortions and residual forms of ugliness, quite frankly. And as we look into our own lives, we see this. That's why we still go to confession post-baptism. So my point is that even though I know I'm not guaranteed indefectibility or infallibility in my personal life in the way the church is, the fact is the church is guaranteed those things in a very limited way. Let's put it that way. So my point would be, as the church unfolds revelation, like the mustard seed to the tree, as it goes along in history, it is also a church of sinners, and therefore these kinds of distortions, these kinds of scars, these kinds of permanent sort of wounds in the church are going to remain and remain for quite a while. And this is part of, I think, the theodramatic structure. That's just because the church is in her core sanctified. You get my point, but also she remains a church of sinners. But anyway, that's just food for meditation down the road. Rachel, I'm going to come back to you now for my readers and viewers and stuff. I'm going to be interviewing Rachel next week on a wonderful article she had in the latest issue of Communio called "The Flesh." The flesh. All right. And I'm also going to be interviewing tomorrow Michael Dominic Taylor on his article in here. But Matter as Revelation is your article. So I don't want to anticipate that too much. But it goes back to something you said, Rachel, about Ulrich, and then about something Adrian just said. I was just reading a great article in the Thomist. I just recently subscribed to the Thomist just so I could get some back electronic issues. And so, but they make you subscribe to the whole darn thing. But anyway, so I did. But I'm glad I did, because in the latest issue of the Thomist is a great article by a guy named Michael Higgins called "The Gratuitous as Necessary and Due." And he begins actually by quoting Nicholas Healy. It's all about de Lubac, and you'd be interested in, Rachel, if you don't know the article already. In the second half of the article, he's discussing Ulrich. And for my viewers, I mean, Rachel did her doctoral dissertation on Ferdinand Ulrich. So, and in essence, the long story short, Higgins' point is that in order to properly understand what de Lubac is up to, we need to take another look at what we mean by gratuitous. That the gratuitous doesn't necessarily rule out the required or the necessary and the due, which is in some ways what you were hinting at a little bit, Adrian, when you were talking about how there's this unfolding, but also there's a kind of requirement of certain things. But anyway, Rachel, I'm just sort of free spinning things here now. I'm going to turn it over to you to say whatever you want us. You can respond to what I just said, part or in whole, or something the other said, and go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, well, a couple of things. The first thing I just want to say is, like, it struck me, Larry, as you were sort of talking about even just confession and sort of how that fits into all of this, right? Like, it's so interesting how, like, the sort of dialectic that Adrian set up at the beginning of this, right? Like, it's just sort of historical, or it's just sort of ideas or something like that. I mean, if one is honest, one just has to sort of admit that, like, life doesn't conform to either one of those, right? Theories,
exactly.
so to speak.
Right.
Because like, on the one hand, if it's sort of just history, then we're sort of bumbling about without being directed at all. And, like, even sort of subhuman life just cannot do such a thing, right? Like, it's just, it's like literally impossible, right? But on the other hand, like, life wouldn't exist without without history and without at all. And then you have the church sort of taking exactly this into account, that it can't be either or, right? Because like something like confession would actually be impossible if it was one of those two options. Either one, actually, right? Like you need both the eternal truth and this like playing out in the sort of freedom to play out in history. So that just kind of struck me. But I mean, at the risk of being very one note, but it is sort of my thing. I mean, like as all of you guys were speaking, the thing, of course, for me that keeps coming up is space and time, or it's like time, space, and matter, essentially, or and space and matter, sort of an interesting to sort of distinguish between the two of them. But right, that creation is given both time and space, right, in order to unfold, right? I mean, in fact, like when we sort of cannot help but think about unfolding without thinking about time and space. And it just kind of struck me, this idea of participation in ideas, right, or in truth, right? To participate precisely means to be other than, actually, right? Like, because you can't participate in something if you're exactly the same as it, right? So to participate actually, like, precisely means to be other. And in order to be other, there has to be this to be other than, right, there has to be sort of time and space in which to do that, actually, right? And so, yeah, I guess the thing that I have just been thinking the whole time is, this gift that we call creation, or that I understand creation to be, necessarily requires this sort of externalization that we kind of call time and space, right? It's interesting because, like, in the Timaeus, Plato calls Cora, he calls it like a womb, basically, and I've been thinking about that a lot. Cora is kind of like both like space and matter a little bit, and the thing about a womb is, like, at the beginning, it doesn't look like anything at all, right? Like in a woman's body, like it's not like you can see the fact that she has a womb, but then like, once a child is in there, once the other is there, right? It always had to be that way. And so, like, there's this, it almost seems like it's, I mean, to go to Mike Higgins' point, like the gratuitous, right, the child almost seems necessary after the fact, right? Like, and so, right. But like what enabled the child to be there from the beginning was like totally hidden at the beginning. And it seems to me this idea of like historical mediation of being, the reason we can kind of take it for granted almost is because it sort of feels like, oh, it always had to be that way. But like the capacity for being to be mediated historically, right, it like is there from the beginning in creation. And it's something we take for granted, but actually the gratuitous is sort of necessary to tie it up with Mike Higgins' point. Yeah.
So you're familiar with the Higgins article, Rachel? I'm
familiar with Mike Higgins.
You're familiar with Mike.
DC Schindler's brother-in-law.
Really?
Yeah.
I did not. Oh, geez. Shows how ignorant I am. I'm sitting here. I get this thing in the mail. So that's an interesting title to an article. And I'm reading along and I wonder who this Michael Higgins guy is. Oh, geez. Am I out of the loop? I feel foolish that I didn't know that this was DC Schindler's brother-in-law.
We overlapped a bit at the JP2 Institute. So yeah.
What's that?
We overlapped a bit at the JP2 Institute. So yeah.
Well, that's very good. So no wonder why.
Good guy. He's a good guy. I mean, he's a good guy and smart guy and interesting guy for sure.
Yeah. Well, maybe I should get him on here someday. Yeah. So that brings me to everything you just said, Rachel, spurred in my mind a question, which is, we're talking about the historical mediation of being, and here we mean sort of the historical mediation of God's self-revelation of being as such in time and history, the timeless one. And I don't think God is timeless, so to speak, in a privative sort of way. But nevertheless, that's a different conversation. The thing is, the question arises, what is being mediated? Not just in terms of, well, being is being mediated, God's being mediated in time and history. Well, what is that? And it strikes me that in a Christian register in particular, that we need to say that what is being mediated is Christ. And in many ways, the Paschal Christ, the cruciform Christ, which means there has to be. We began with Adrian saying, that there's got to be a constitutive reason why God does this through time and history. And it has always struck me when I think about this is that there is a kenotic, almost cruciform element to our living in time and in history. And I don't mean just that bad things happen to us. I mean that there is a complete inability for us to grasp at the moment, to grasp at time. There is this constant flux between Heraclitus and Parmenides. We have this, on one hand, this longing for transcendence, to grab it, to grasp it, to acquire it. All right. On the other hand, we cannot, because it is not given to us to know truth like that. It is given to us to know it piecemeal, partially, in ways that come and go, that moment that comes to you and then you think, I should write that down, and then it's gone and you forget, oh crap, I forgot all about that. And so there is a death-like quality to our experience of time. And I don't just mean we're all trending towards biological death. I mean, the moment that was just before is completely gone in some sense, and yet what is coming is actually already now here, and yet not. And so you get my point. There is this almost crucifixion in our experience of life as lived through time and history, and yet also at the same time a great joy. So those are just some thoughts off the top of my head about it. So Rodney, I want to turn it over to you. You don't have to respond to that. Genius insight on my part, or not.
Can I just say something before you go, Rodney? Sorry,
yes, please.
to reply to that, Larry. Like, I mean, the interesting thing about it is, I mean, and I don't think that, I think this goes along with your point that it's cruciform, right? Like, on the one hand, it's like you said, we sort of can't grasp it, and there's if the moment is sort of perfect, we can't hold on to it, whatever, or however you might put it. But on the other hand, it's precisely in time and space that we can be given like perfections in each moment, actually, right? That like one moment, I mean, the whole discussion of time is another thing, right? Because what is it exactly, right? But like one moment kind of can't hold all of the perfections that there are to be given and to be seen and to be received in creation. And so, on the one hand, it's, it's cruciform and canonic, and you kind of can't hold on to those moments. And on the other hand, it's such a gift that, like, we're sort of like, time is given this capacity, so to speak, to keep holding successive perfections, right, within it. And again, like, I don't think that contradicts your point about it being cruciform. It rather sort of supports that. But there's two ways to look at that, actually. So yeah.
This point is made brilliantly by the late great David L. Schindler in his book, Heart of the World, Center of the Church, the great essay in there in Time and Eternity, where he talks about T.S. Eliot, and he talks about this cruciform nature of our experience of time, of life, is precisely what the saints understood. It's precisely so it goes to what you're saying, Rachel. The saints were able to grasp it through their lives, but also in their intellects, precisely this dynamic that you were talking about. But anyway, Rodney, go ahead.
Yeah, so this will take us into some, I don't know if new waters, but sort of, risky waters,
Sure,
or whatever. But it seems to me that those in the church who have a tendency to reject, or who are uncomfortable with the historicity or historical mediation, I think also have a concept of the nature of God that sort of goes with that thing. And in Balthasar's, sort of allegation would be that there's an insufficient recognition of how radical the Trinity changes our concept of God, right? So that already in God, the divinity is in some weird sense mediated in 3 different ways, right? You know, I mean, and there's no grasping after it to be not mediated in 3 different ways, if you can put it that way, right? So the fact that like the incarnate Son does not, he becomes incarnate precisely because he does not see equality with the Father as something to be grasped after, right? So there would be something, I think, in a kind of ahistorical, strictly propositional understanding of truth, which would be a kind of grasping at having all the thing at once in a kind of sure way, so precisely I don't have to experience any difference, any disconnect, you know, at all, right? So that my mission would be laid out in advance. I would know every step I have to take. I would take it exactly as I sometimes kind of am amused at how little Jesus told the disciples that he could have told them. Like one thing, for instance, like, hey, Jews don't have to be Gentiles coming into the church don't have to be circumcised. Like, I'm like, you have 40 days after the resurrection to tell the disciples this. Like, well, why don't you tell them that, you know? But precisely, they need to come to understand why it's the case that Gentiles don't need to be circumcised who are coming into the church, right? And there's something about the faith that's been given to them that already has the secret to why it's the case. But if it's just given to them, they don't discover it. They don't really know it in the, what is Newman makes the distinction between a notional assent and real assent. Yes. So if everything were laid out, we would have all these notional assents to all these propositions, but we wouldn't have like Paul doing this beautiful thing where he's finding out why it's okay these people are being received into the church without being circumcised. And I think in some sense, what I guess I'm trying to say in a convoluted way probably is that this has to be rooted in the very nature of God somehow, because it can't just be opposite. It can't just be that God is totally one way and all of us are totally another, because that's not the analogy of being. It's dialectic, or it's something. Adrian could probably tell me what it is, but it's not, I don't think it's analogy in the proper sense. So those are just some thoughts.
Those are good thoughts, and I like those thoughts because it certainly drags in then Trinitarian theology, which of course is lurking in the background of all of these conversations about the historical mediation of being, the nature of the Trinitarian relations, and what Trinitarian ontology best underwrites this project that we're talking about here, this interplay of truth and historicity. And that's why I sort of began too, Rodney, by talking a little bit about the theodramatic structure of truth, because this is embedded in the very nature of the Trinity as such, as a perichoretic set of infinite relations that involve, Rachel, you said that, you know, participation can in some sense only take place at a distance. And that's certainly true of creaturely participation, but its ground of possibility is precisely in the distinctions within the Godhead, as Balthasar says, infinite distance bridged with an infinite unity. We think now that we understand difference and distinction, we don't even begin to understand what difference and distinction actually really mean until we're going to encounter difference and distinction in God in an infinite register that has been overcome through perichoretic love. I mean, I don't want to get it too deep into all of the subtleties of Trinitarian theology, because I would get myself in hot water anyway. It's been a while for me, but I agree with all of that, Rodney. Does anybody want to respond to what Rodney said or anything I just said? Rachel, Adrian?
Maybe I could just throw in a thought that seems relevant to what you guys have just said and connects back to the seed analogy as Rachel developed it. And that would be the notion of fruitfulness, which is, of course, you know, rooted in the Gospels. And I suppose you know, I mean, we all know, right, that in John's gospel, Christ seems very invested in the disciples bearing much fruit. And I suppose we could, I think a lot of us would probably spontaneously think that that fruit is sort of basically merits, you know, it's basically things that are sort of meritorious for salvation. And that's doubtless also the case, right? That's doubtless also the case. But it could be that that there's also a relation to there's a relationship between fruitfulness and truth. And if so, then that would sort of tie back into this kind of Trinitarian point that you guys are making, because you know, it's not as if the Son's having divinity or the Spirit's having divinity sort of adds a missing piece to
Yeah.
the divinity of the Father, and yet nobody would say that it's sort of superfluous, you know, that there be the Son and the Spirit. I mean, it seems that in fact you could think of, you know, the procession of the Son, the generation of the Son with Saint Bonaventure. You could think of it as he says, sort of unfolding. He uses the verb explicare. It unfolds the kind of fontal, what he calls the fontal plenitude of the Father. So it sort of unfolds, as Bonaventure says, the fontal plenitude, but then that also means that he somehow unfolds his own, the Son's unfolds his own generation and the procession of the Holy Spirit from the kind of ground of the Father, from this fontal plenitude. So it's sort of like there's a full, you know, consubstantial participation, if you want to use that language, on the part of the Son in precisely unfolding, unfurling the fruitfulness of the Father, so that there aren't two fruitfulnesses, but that doesn't mean that the fruitfulness is limited to just one person, and then the Father, and then the other two are just sort of kind of passive results. I mean, they're actually in. I mean, the Son is actually
right
involved in you know, explicating the fruitfulness of the Father, to the point of also being involved in co-spirating the Holy Spirit. And you sort of see that. I mean, this again is something Ulrich really developed. So Rachel could tell us a lot about this, but I mean, you know, you sort of see that all the way down. You know, you see creation is a bit like that. You know, I mean, God, in his generosity, not only gives things to be, but he gives things to sort of unfold their being, and therefore kind of cooperate in manifesting his own creative purposes for them, and so on, right? I think you kind of see that all the way down the line, and I also think that you see sort of adumbrations of this way of looking at things in Plato, you know, in Plato and Aristotle. So like today I was thinking about, you know, kind of in my philosophy of nature class, I was thinking about or afterwards, actually, I was thinking about the way in which, you know, Aristotle defines nature, physis, as a kind of principle, as a kind of arche. And in another passage, he says that's what God is. God is the arche from which nature and the universe depend, or on which nature and the universe depend. So, so he's all arche. God is all arche, in this Trinitarian way, of course, that we were talking about. But because he's pure act, right? But we're not all arche ourselves, and yet we have one in ourselves. And it's sort of that arche, that principle, that source that we have in ourselves is kind of, in one sense, it's divided between a sort of given material basis for us to start from, on the one hand, and then a kind of activity of starting on the other hand, that we're the subjects of. But the kind of absolutely amazing thing to me is that for a body that has a thing, a substance that has a nature in this particular sense, it both is the subject that, by way of a kind of imminent activity, sets itself in motion somehow. I mean, it's true even in an extended sense of inanimate things. And it's also the material base, and it itself also is the material basis from which it starts and in which it expresses itself. So that actually it would have been better, in sort of explaining the relation between matter and form, if Aristotle had used the example not of a sculpture, but of a dancer. Because if you look at a dancer who is sort of doing, is like, I've been watching a little bit of sort of classical Indian dance on YouTube, and it's really amazing. It's mostly women, it seems, that do this, and their entire body is in motion, directly or indirectly. And at the same time, their body is the material, but they're also the ones doing the dancing. So that you see what I'm getting at is that
absolutely,
that even for Aristotle, like a natural body, which is the has a principle of motion in itself, of motion and change in itself, sort of is like a self-subjective matter that, in being such, sort of reveals something of what it means for God to be arche, to be source, but in this kind of good otherness, right? That then, like as Rachel says, sort of downstream involves, extension and, in space and also in time. And you have to ask, well, what's the point of that? Well, the point of that, first of all, is just generosity, right? So that but think about that the logos of the natural thing, the logos of its nature, is sort of made to be kind of unfurled by the thing in this kind of self-subjectively material kind of possession of archehood, of sourcehood in itself, and there's there's a kind of fruitfulness there, right? There's a kind of principle of fruitfulness there, and that means something, and that fruitfulness, just to tie it together to what I said at the beginning, is perhaps you could see it not only in the register of the good, which you have to, but also in the register of the true, and also in the register of the beautiful, right? Insofar as it involves a kind of self-manifestation, from the inside. Anyway, that's a bunch of things kind of.
Well, actually, that was brilliant. I was just riveted by that. That was, for those listeners, that was 10 minutes of graduate level erudition right there, Rodney. I mean, Rodney. God, I keep calling Adrian Rodney. I guess I think of you guys
I'll take that compliment.
interchangeable somehow. Yeah. Does
take that.
anybody want to respond? I kind of want to shift gears here in
Rodney,
a minute,
you're muted.
but let's go with Rodney.
Rodney, you're muted.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, so I just want to do just a quick follow-up question on that, and then I'm glad to shift gears. But so Adrian, just a couple of things of by way of clarification.
Yeah, because it was sort of like probably a series of associative leaps. So I hope,
no, but super interesting stuff at the end. It seems to me that about so kind of like kind of getting to the point that sort of matter is not just sort of passively receiving form or something like that, but there's a kind of almost, is there like maybe a readiness, and then matter already has something in it that's going to perform the way it receives the form, and sort of all that stuff in an interesting way that's not predictable, so to speak.
Am I on two different Zooms?
Yeah, you're all of a sudden on two different screens here.
Can you get me off? Can you get me off of one?
There, you can kick him out of, just kick one of them off.
Right.
I'm
hang on.
lowercase
letters. He looks like E. Cummings in that one. There you go. That's better. Yeah.
Okay.
There we go.
Okay.
Gotcha. Thank you,
So-
Rachel. I like how Rachel immediately chimed in, knowing that I'm a complete Luddite. That
Well,
I
just
would at that moment I was panicking because I thought I have no freaking idea how to do anything about this. I
Okay,
just
gotcha.
click the Zoom button and then it goes. And it's like a gas pedal in a car. Don't ask me to fix the Johnson rod. Yeah, it's just like, I don't know what that is. I just hit the gas pedal, right? And it moves. So anyway, okay. So that was it. Go ahead. Go ahead, Adrian.
Just a quick follow-up. Go ahead.
Right. You were going to ask a question. Go ahead.
Well, so just a follow-up that is related. So to help me with the analogy a little bit, like, I mean, I'm assuming there's a choreographer involved in the dance, right? So and this would be, it reminds me a little bit of like jazz music, where you're going to do a tune. Yes.
There you go. Nice. Yeah.
Yeah. And the song sort of has the role of act to potency to some degree, right? So we're going to do my favorite things or whatever. But then there's a way in which John Coltrane is going to play my favorite things that's going to be very different, probably from some, Oscar Peterson or something, or whatever. And am I on the right page there, or?
Yes, you are, as far as I'm concerned. So, I mean, as to the first point, I would say, there has to be, you have to think of matter as to do with a certain readiness. We think of matter, I think, primarily as a kind of spatialized arrangement. And then any movement we think of as sort of accidentally happening between the parts of the arrangement, any natural body at any given moment is going to have some kind of, it's going to have and even depend on having some kind of arrangement. But that's not, so that's, shall we say, a necessary manifestation of the essence of matter, but it's not in and of itself the essence of matter. And the essence of matter would have to do much more with something that Plato already saw, which Rachel referred to, that matter is this kind of womb-like, affording of place for the chora. So anyway, so I'll let Rachel kind of go into that more. But in terms of the second point, you're absolutely on the money as far as I'm concerned, because so if I may, just to go on for a minute or two to give a little background. So I'm struck by the way in which Aristotle says that in of other places, but I just most immediately chapter 3 of book 2 of the Physics, that there's a way in which the form of artistry is more the cause of the product than the individual artist. And you could see why he would say that especially if you think of sort of like a traditional art form, like this Indian dancing, where you just have to give yourself over in readiness, right? And there would be this sort of readiness of matter to embody both the form of the artistry and the choreography, or at least the canons of choreography, in a kind of selfless way, right? And you know, so many of the artists, even the modern kind of artists whom we love, do that in some way, you know. And so that would be it. So it's like you yeah, there's a way that mastery of the dance form, the dance artistry and the choreography is like embodying it in a kind of selfless manner. That's the paradox. That seems paradoxical. Now, it seems to me that embodying the form, whether the artistry or the choreography, in this kind of selfless manner, which is mastery, enables exactly the sort of thing that we were talking about relative to the church at the beginning, right? A kind of basic fidelity to the canons together with improvisation, right? And as a matter of fact, now I don't know much about Indian dancing, but or music, classical Indian music, but it does seem like in a lot of classical Indian music, you have these given canons, and then the masters of these canons will do these improvisations, but they'll never violate the canons, you know. And you know, so that's how I would think about it. And so it's sort of, again, to also tied to Rachel's point at the beginning, you know, it's sort of like the dancer or the piano player or whatever it is, the jazz player is completely given over and has been given over to and trained into being kind of like, as an agent, being almost like a kind of living exponent of the art and of the canons, as if he were giving them a personality to sort of manifest themselves in, right? And yet in doing that, he's anything but a slave. He's a master. Yeah. And it's precisely that type of obedient mastery to the canons, which in some sense remain immovable, like the canons of right, that he's able to sort of improvise, and that improvisation can take you know, can take a beautiful account of, you know, everything that's happening around him or her, you know, whoever is the artist, right? So yeah, I think that's a great example.
And the canons remain. So it kind of, this kind of then shifts to the sort of what I wanted to shift gears into, because I can hear all of my viewers and podcast listeners, cut to the chase. Does this mean that the church can contradict herself? Does this mean that God is doing a new thing now, that we can just sort of, you know, freestyle our way into the ever-changing future of the church of the amazing now and all that kind of stuff? Obviously not. So I like what you said. The canons remain. The canons remain even in the midst of all of this. In the midst of all of this improvisation. So this raises the issue then of development of doctrine, what it means.
Precisely.
What does it mean when the church is going to change and evolve? It certainly simply cannot mean that the canons are whatever the hell we say they are now, or that we can just dismiss with them altogether, because after all, God is a God of surprises, as
Yeah,
recent
can
prelates.
I
Go
just
ahead. Go ahead.
throw out something? And I'm sorry forgive me, you guys, for talking so much, but I'll just say this and then I'll stop. I mean, actually, I'm glad we had this conversation, because I actually think that the kind of notion of becoming a master within an artistic tradition, especially where when tradition is traditional, like classical Indian dancing, or Gregorian chant, or icon painting. I think that actually really helps to sort of, so that
Yes.
and again, it goes right back to what Rachel said at the beginning. I mean, she just nailed the principle right at the beginning, which is it's precisely the total not only obedience to, but sort of complete interiorization of the canons as, in some sense, utterly immovable, that enables a kind of improvisational riffing.
Yeah, exactly.
That won't violate the canons ever, and B, will actually contribute precisely in fruitful ways to our appreciation of the canons and of the kind of manifestation of God's truth that the canons enable.
Yeah, because and that it's precisely actually better art, better music, better dancing, and so on, precisely because of that dynamic. If there are no canons, if everything is just freestyling turtles all the way down, okay, then all of a sudden it becomes boring, banal, pointless. That there's no longer any mastery there of anything. It goes back to some of the debates that were had in the mid 20th century about music and musicality, the rejection of classical understandings in favor of, a more cacophonous, non-rule based approach to music, John Cage and stuff like that. But anyway, Rachel, you've been chafing at the bit to say something, and I don't want to ignore the lone female voice here. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, maybe this is stretching too much. I don't think it is, but I mean, just unpacking Adrian's points a little bit. I mean, so if the dancer is the form, right, kind of, but also the canons of the form, and sort of, and then, it's just so interesting, in your example of a dancer, but I think this could be true of any art, right? Which is, I want to give Aristotle back some credit for using the sculpture analogy, but
sure. Sure, Rachel. Sure,
but one of the reasons we use artifice to try and explain form and matter is because it's easier to see the distinction between the two, right? But in the best kind of art, right, and I mean that term super broadly, the form and the matter sort of meld into each other, right? Or one, right? And so like the form gives itself over to the matter. So using your dancer analogy, right? Like you don't see a difference between the dancer and the dance, actually, right? At all. And when you do see the difference between form and matter is actually when it's done somewhat poorly, right? And that matter, I mean, again, this is analogous language, but matter hasn't actually given itself over to form, and vice versa. Form hasn't given itself over to matter, right? Well, if we take that analogy and sort of move it to development of doctrine and the church, right? Like the reason we see the straining is because we haven't sort of given over, actually, right? Like we haven't fully, we haven't fully submitted, really. And so it seems like it's different when it actually shouldn't be, and we're all experiencing that tension in a way that like bad art shows the tension, like the matter is almost like rebelling against the form, and the form doesn't quite understand the matter, actually, in like a bad sculpture or something like that.
Yes, that's right.
So Yeah, so it's like, again, like we talk about these things, you know, they're distinct, the principles are distinct, form and matter, but like in the best examples, both in natural things and in artifice, like you actually can't see the difference.
Well, that's right, because the danced body is the dancing body.
Right.
And I mean,
Yeah.
you know, and I mean, this puts me in mind of Balthasar's wonderful essay on theology and holiness in Verbum Caro, you know, the first volume of the Explorations in Theology, in which he says that the saints, and of course, in the back of his mind is not only the saints, but I mean the incarnate Word. He says the saints become a canonical display of the truth that they proclaim. And that's exactly the point that you're making, Rachel, that you know, there the danced body and the dancing body are one, because you know, there's been a total giving over of the saint into, you know, as St. Paul says in the letter to the Romans, you know, that he talks about the Christians surrendering themselves over into the pattern of doctrine.
Yeah, and
You know,
this is, I mean, this is the point Chesterton makes a lot with regard to the saints, right? Which is we can like, and this goes back to your earlier point about improvisation, Adrian,
Yeah.
right? Like, you know, if we're saying the saints are sort of the dance body and the dancing body, or, you know, together, this is why there can be such a variety of saints, and that's not a problem. It's not a contradiction.
Exactly.
It is simply a living out of what's been given in all of these, in this multiplicity and diversity of ways, precisely like as it should be.
Well, that's right.
Yeah,
that's right. And so it allows for exactly what Larry was saying a couple of minutes ago. I mean, that all of this sort of helps to explain, or at least make plausible, the sort of claim that, again, you sort of made at the very beginning, namely the fact that everything is given at the beginning and everything is received at the beginning. The fact then that there are sort of immovable canons which are sort of interiorized to create this kind of unity we're talking about is what enables a kind of newness and freshness, which will be, you know, among other things, not only will be holiness, not only in the sort of order of the good, but as David Schindler would always say, it would be holiness also in the order of the understanding. It'll be, and the unity of those two things is the beautiful for Balthasar, right? So it'll be a beauty of holiness that actually plays a role in kind of the perspective of fruitfulness in unfolding, showing forth the kind of power and fecundity of the canons, and behind the canons, the power and fecundity of God's truth, you know. So you really will have a kind of reconciliation between a kind of good multiplicity, a kind of good newness, and a kind of absolute unerring, you know, fidelity to what the faith that's been delivered once and for all to the saints, period.
Wow, exactly.
Yeah. Can I just
Rodney, go ahead.
One thing that comes to mind here, that's there's a kind of a paradox here, just to go back to the jazz analogies for a second, because this is really good. What you guys are saying is so helpful. We often think of actually John Coltrane as a sort of almost a betrayer of the jazz tradition, because he got, you know, he was the kind of the father of avant-garde jazz or whatever. Right. But the fact of the matter is, and this is what's sort of the paradox of Coltrane. First of all, there was nobody more steeped in the tradition of jazz than John Coltrane. So he's deeply drunk from the wells of all the greats before him, all the way back to Parker and Lester Young and all those guys. But the year or the 2 years before he started his avant-garde phase, he literally kind of lived with Thelonious Monk, and Monk, you know, sort of taught him all the stuff he needed. He knew that he had a lot to learn, in other words, right? So here's a lot of humility, going to one of the quote fathers of jazz to be trained for a year before he's willing to go out and take the risks that he takes. Now he can take those risks because he's full of the tradition, right? So it's just like that's it, right? So it's so the problem we're getting so much in the church today, of course, is that people think that they're only able to be creative when they the tradition, but then of course they're not. It's so banal. It's so repetitive of stuff that was said in 1968 or 1972. It doesn't sound interesting at all. Whereas, you know, those who are being creatively faithful, I mean, Balthasar doesn't sound like anybody before him in a way, and yet he's just doing the same thing that the great.
Absolutely. Exactly. You know, I read something the other day that said, you know, at the very least, say, for example, Cardinal McElroy's essay in America magazine, you know, is raising a conversation that we need to have. To which I said to somebody, no, it's a conversation we already had. Right? And it's old and it's banal, and it's been answered, and it's been answered definitively by John Paul and others. And so I'm not here to reopen that question and that debate, that conversation. And to point out, Rodney, there's a certain banality to what's going on in the church today that is simply the rehashing of other banalities.
But isn't it interesting that so both the calling into question of the canons and the failure to sort of enact, you know, what we could call creative fidelity to the tradition, which is the very soul of the tradition, in the sense that we've been laying out, should be connected with or should take the form of a kind of calling into question of the sexual teaching, which is about, you know, as Balthasar says again in another wonderful essay in Homo Creatus Est, you know, man was created, called tradition, which is sort of the, you know, which the sexual teaching has to do with the fundamental form of tradition, which is handing on life to the next generation. Right. And you know, there too, right? I mean, there's an immovable canon, which is, you know, human nature, and you know, the sexual act is generative. And Balthasar makes this beautiful point in that essay that the pleasure of the act is actually a kind of redundancy of the precisely the generativity of it, you know, which he sees as a kind of, you know, and it's this very Aristotelian point, is a kind of experience of completion in giving away, the completion of being and giving being away.
Right, exactly.
But that act and the pleasure of it is both situated within and helps carry you know, the whole sort of self-transmission of humanity as a natural and sort of cultural entity, you know. And so that all of the morality, all of the manners and morals and rituals that surround sex and the art of love and marriage are sort of both prisms or sort of like lenses for focusing, and at the same time are like sources of this kind of self-traditioning of man. And so it's not an accident, I think, that you know, this failure to be traditional in this sense, and that, you know, in the sort of ecclesial sense, is tied up with a kind of calling into question of what it means to be traditional in this kind of generative educative sense, you know,
Yeah,
in that
yeah,
culture.
exactly. I think there's
those things are created. Those two things are connected, you know, because at the core of the ecclesial tradition is the Eucharist, which is kind of like the way that, you know, is the sort of nuptial relation between Christ and his church enacted in the Eucharist, which is the kind of fulfillment of the kind of natural symbolism of the generative, you know, act. So I mean, these things are deeply connected with each other. It's not an
exactly. I like the fact you mentioned the canon of human nature as such, because along these same lines that you're talking about, it's very instructive, right? That the more things change, the more they stay the same. The curve of the human shoulder it's always the same. That whenever from time immemorial cultures have declined,
right.
They always decline in the direction of a sexual debauchery.
Right.
There's an absolute sociological correlation between the decline of any civilization and the rise of complete sexual debauchery. And yet today we consider it a form of enlightenment, something new and different, and nobody's ever thought this way before. And it's just, I wish most modern people could just go back and read some of the exploits of the average sort of citizen of Rome, say around 150, 200 AD, to get us. It would make our sexual exploits look tame in comparison. But anyway,
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say just one last point. I mean, we see the same thing, the same sort of pattern of creative fidelity also in the sort of the sphere of generation and of education, right? In the sphere of the kind of self-traditioning of humanity, because it's in giving yourself over to the canons that you're fruitful on every level. You know, you're fruitful of new life.
Yeah.
You're fruitful in the sense of a kind of art of love. You know, you're fruitful also in the sense that there's a kind of you know, giving of there's a kind of entrance into a sort of good self-mastery. And this is another point that I just wanted to make, that just relative to that self-mastery, is that absent that kind of self-mastery, again, that comes through obedience to the canons, we actually don't really have complete access to our own subjectivity, which means that we don't have complete access to our political subjectivity, which means that we're fodder for cybernetics. We become, instead of political subjects, we become cybernetic objects. And so we're ready for technological tyranny. And that's another thing. It's another thing that all these people that are calling into question the sexual teaching of the church just don't see. They don't see that, you know, it's not about sort of affirming these individuals who feel this way or that way. They're conspiring with a whole sort of anthropological drift in the civilization that goes from that basically is about reducing obedientially self-mastering political subjects to objects for cybernetic control.
Absolutely. Last week, my latest article in Catholic Old Report was called Cardinal Supich and the Hermeneutics of the Abyss, and I was
I've got to read that.
You got to go read it. I was taking Cardinal Supich to task for his gross and despicable misuse of Pope Benedict's theology in order to endorse the very project of non-creative faithfulness here. I just found it absolutely despicable, and so I had to say something, and so I did. But the point was exactly what you're saying here, is that it regardless of the specific quote that he had from Pope Benedict, the problem with what Cardinal Supich was doing in invoking Benedict in order to endorse his project by cherry picking something from Benedict was that he therefore fundamentally misunderstands Benedict's basic insight into the crisis we face today. And that crisis is exactly this theodramatic and anthropological crisis that you were just talking about the cybernetic threat.
Right.
What I call, well, I allude to Benedict's opening in Introduction to Christianity, where he talks about Teresa of Lisieux, despite all of the things she had going for her in terms of Catholic culture, family upbringing, still was deeply, deeply, deeply tempted by atheism. Yeah. And it was Ratzinger who used the phrase, she felt the abyss below. She felt the nothingness below. Right. She felt the yawning chasm of modernity's anomie, its meaninglessness, right, enveloping her. And what Benedict understood was, this is the crisis of our age. I mean, this is what he calls the eclipse of God. Yeah. This is what he got. And so, the abyss, that's why I say Cardinal Supich misses the entire point of Benedict's theology, which was a kind of cri de coeur against this sort of modern crisis of meaning. So anyway, but by all means, go read it. I think you might enjoy it. But I want to shift gears a little bit. We're now coming up in about an hour and a half of doing this, which is great. Okay. We don't. I'm not going to put any time constraints on this. We can talk for however long we want to talk. The four of us don't get together enough. And I want to turn it over back to Rachel and Rodney as well. But it does. As we were talking, it strikes me that in all of this, all this talk about canons and creative fidelity and the history and the mediation of being and so on, is that this is precisely why it is still of vital importance. It's why it is so still critically important to understand the absolute meaningfulness of ressourcement theology, of communio type theology, because it embodies precisely what Rodney was talking about the Coltrane, right? Being so immersed in the culture of jazz, so immersed in it that he was then able, in a sense, to riff on it. As I think that was your word, Adrian, to riff on it like that. This is what ressourcement theologians like de Lubac, Balthasar Ratzinger, Daniel Lu, all of them were doing. I mean, they were so immersed in the tradition that they were then able to develop things creatively, which is one of the reasons why I get so upset when I hear people criticizing Balthasar for, was dürfen wir hoffen, mistranslated as dare we hope, like, well, he's a heretic because he thinks that maybe everybody's good. God, pull your head out of your rear end. It's so infuriating to me. Right. I refer to such theology as just so wooden, so flat-footed. It's what we used to pejoratively call Denzinger theology. You can go and memorize 10 million catechism verses, 10 million Denzinger, and those things are all necessary. And certainly memorizing those things would be a good thing. Absolutely. It would be. Yeah. But to reduce theology to those things is precisely the problem. And then on the other side of the equation, of course, we've been critical of the Supiches, the McElroys, the whole progressive, God is doing a new thing, surprise us, Lord, sort of thing. And it seems to me, and I don't mean to reduce this to facile political categories, but it does seem to me that there is a tremendous amount at stake here, which is why theology matters, and why it's terribly important that communio theology not be eclipsed, that it not be forgotten. I know Rodney and I had a conversation with D.C. Schindler and Mike Hanby, maybe about 3 or 4 months ago, before the passing of Dave's father. And Dave was saying that that's one of his fears, is that precisely that in the current ecclesial environment, communio theology is simply being ignored and eclipsed and bypassed.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Rachel, did you want to say something to that?
Yeah. Well, it just struck me. So, start going a little bit back to Adrian's point about all the norms around sexuality, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, in us sort of talking about the canons and then being creative after that. I mean, I was just thinking like, yeah, it's just kind of interesting that in a certain way, on a certain level, certainly physically, the most creative action possible for a human being is a child, actually, right? And it's funny, like there's really only one way to get it. We sort of like have sort of perverted it in a couple of different ways, but like actually, like you kind of have like you have to follow a certain order in order to do it, right? Like in order to have a child, and yet, yeah, exactly, and yet, like, yeah, like that's the most creative physical act possible, like is generating another human being, it seems to me. So but it just struck me, Larry, I was thinking about that, and then all of the racehorse theologians that you just named, plus more, care for children, like, and talk about them in their theology, actually, which I had never really kind of thought of before. But it seems to me, Balthazar, de Lubac, I forget who else you named, but they
Daniel Lu,
they all reference the child, actually. Like a child is not a secondary thought for them, actually. Like the child is really significant in all of their, now probably to greater and less degrees, but in all of their writing. And so again, this sort of, like the most creative we can be is actually sort of, we have to sort of rely on the canon of human nature, so to speak, right? But that's not just true physically, it's true metaphysically, it seems to me. And so, the image that springs to mind is Portal and Mystery of Hope in Piggy, talking about the little child Hope, right? Like the little child Hope is always returning to her parents. So, for those who haven't read it, right, in the Portal of the Mystery of Hope, the little child Hope, it's like a family. The image to think of is a family walking along and with their little kids, and like the little child Hope is like the kid always sort of runs forward and runs back to her parents, right? Runs forward and runs back. So she always has to come, again, that sort of circling back to the origin in order to be free and, creative, if we want to put it that way. But and it's such a almost sort of banal image. Like we all know it. As soon as Piggy says it, we all know it. But like the child has to run back to the origin, so to speak, her parents, in order to be free. And so right there, you kind of have just in a very sort of normal image, like exactly what we've been talking about, I think, during our
and in Piggy, I'm glad you brought up Piggy, Rachel, because there's also in Piggy a concept, the sort of normativity of the flesh. One of the reasons why the child keeps arcing back to the parents is because the parents, the mother is the physical woman upon which that child nursed. The father is the person who brings home, the money and so forth, or works the farm in physical ways to nurture the child in very, very concrete material ways. So as in Peggy, you get all the time this returning to the flesh. And I think that's also something that's being ignored in these current debates is the normativity of our bottling. And I don't mean bottliness in an abstraction. I mean the normativity of sarks, the normativity of the many. I like what Rodney said earlier. I did it again. Adrian said earlier about the sort of rituals surrounding lovemaking and so on. That pertains to a certain, a certain constant sort of normativity of certain ways of doing. There's only so many ways that human beings have made love down through the course of the centuries, regardless of what various people might say. And so there's a normativity there as well. Rodney, you look like you want to say something. No?
No, well, no. I mean, this is great. I mean, and I love the way that we've sort of rounded this out by sort of talking about the way in which the form is given to the matter, the choreography is given to the dancer. I mean, there's a beautiful symbiosis there that I think is lost, obviously, sort of on both sides of the theological extreme, where on the one hand, it's just all form, and we deny that there's any material receptivity, or whatever. And then on the other side, it's just. But I wonder, I mean, we can't get into this obviously because we're, it's getting, the day is getting long, and some of us have jobs. But anyhow, but one thing that I would like us, I mean, this would be kind of a fun thing for us to talk about maybe in another episode, would be, the way in which the sort of stuff that was coming out of like the 30s, 40s, and 50s in European thought, the Frankfurt School and things like that, with a kind of weird mixture of sort of Freud and Marx and Nietzsche, sort of literally put on its head everything that we're talking about, so that what is highest no longer measures what is lowest, but in all cases, sort of what is lowest measures what is highest. So you become cynical about anything that's not just sheer libido or whatever you want to be, right? So it's either kind of ego is suppressive of id, or it's in Marx, it's it's all economics driving all of our worldviews and the whole bit. It's all, everything is driven sort of from below, and in some kind of really sad, pathetic way, I actually think that this somehow has gotten into some of the people that in the clergy that we're hearing from. They almost sound like they're coming from this very cynical perspective that what the church has been telling us up till now is, of course, what privileged sort of white males would tell us, right? So that now it's time to hear the voice of God in the marginalized, right? Which means, what we know it means, right? And a real cynicism that we've ever actually heard the word of God, maybe prior to Vatican II, but certainly, but maybe even worse, maybe prior to Vatican II as interpreted by, a certain group, right? Which would mean that everything sort of in the past then would be not only not a source that we would need to learn from and draw from, but we would be suspicious of. So that's kind of where we are, I think. And this is something I think we would, I think, maybe talk about at some point. Is it's not so much even that it's a doubt about whether or not revelation can be mediated in history. It's almost worse than that. It's a kind of conviction that no, what we get from history is just sheer power grabs from people. Right.
Yeah. I agree, Rodney. I think it's a prioritizing of death over life. I mean, yes. I'm reminded of the essay by Hans Jonas, where he says in ancient cultures, right, life was the primordial aboriginal reality, and they saw life wherever there was dynamic movement, right? So stars are alive, rivers are alive, and it was death and immobility and sort of inertial stolidity that was the anomaly that needed explaining. Today is the opposite. Death and that which is purely non-living and inert is the aboriginal reality, and life is the anomaly that needs explaining. And too often we explain it as simply a tragic epiphenomenal accident. Yeah. And I agree with you. I've talked about this a lot. The de facto atheism that is at the heart of so much of what's going on in the church today. It's a bacillus that has infected the church in deep, deep ways. It's a rot, and it's a deep rot. And I hate to end on that note. So let's end on something a little more positive. Rachel, I'm going to give you the last word. Give us a after that after that rant on death and so on. Give us something positive to send us off, and then maybe I'll turn to Adrian too for one last send off.
The last word.
No, yeah. I mean, I think I'm just going to return to the point I made earlier about. I think we often think of time and space as a weight now. And I especially as I get older, I get it. Larry, when I was an undergrad, you always used to like complain to me about your various ailments, and I was always like, what's your problem, man? So now I understand. But like, I'll return to the Timaeus because I'm sort of obsessed with that dialogue, but that's where Plato says that time's a moving image of eternity, right? And it's like a very difficult thing to grasp, that concept. But I think I always think of like a maple tree and how like there's a perfection in that tree in every season, actually, right? Like there's a sort of sparse beauty in the winter, and then of course you have like the budding in the spring that's really beautiful, and then in the summer there's this like lush fullness, and then of course in the fall you have the bright orange hues and everything like that. And like literally without time that would not be possible, right? Like for us to sort of receive those perfections, all of those perfections. And I think that's what Plato's getting at when he says that time's a moving image of eternity, that somehow in eternity that's all there all at once, but we don't have that capacity to receive it all at once. So I'm grateful for time and space, actually, to receive those perfections, actually. So that's
very good.
Uplifting.
And thank you for bringing up all of my ailments, as you call them. That's great. That's great. I've never been a robust person physically. Let's put it that way. If anybody ever wrote my biography, and they should not. If I ever wrote my own autobiography, it would be called Dear Me, because it's just dear me, all the crap that's happened to me. But anyway, I was a sickly hypochondriac little nerdy turdy little boy, and I still am. I'm not so little, fat as a house, but nevertheless. Adrian, all that silliness aside, you want to toss in some last second pearls of wisdom before we sign off?
Well, I don't know how pearly these pearls are going to be, but no, I mean, Plato's disciple, Aristotle, is sort of often accused of, wanting to sort of reduce the real to, the quote unquote static. But in a certain sense, the opposite is the case. I mean, it's, at the heart of his project, close to the heart of his project is saving motion and showing that it actually is intelligible and how it's intelligible, and there's something, that he thinks that natural philosophy, a science of nature, could sort of, in some branches at least, employ mathematics, but it could never be mathematics because he thinks mathematics abstracts from motion. And I think that's true even of
Physics,
more modern types of mathematics that are used in physics today. So there's really nothing that can replace sort of epistemologically the encounter with a moving thing that in moving is both displaying its own inner, I mean, at least in the paradigm cases, this is so, displaying its own sort of inner sourcehood, and at the same time aspiring to a completion that's sort of given originally with the sourcehood, but is also remains to be unfolded, and that motion is has to be understood as a kind of as a kind of erotic self-transcendence. There's a kind of natural love that's being expressed there. Yeah, I think that yeah, and that if we want to sort of that rather than sort of speaking abstractly about, you know, the changing and the unchanging and so forth, I mean, we would do well to kind of think about, you know, this erotic movement towards fullness that we see in natural bodies, especially living ones, you know, and especially human ones, you know, as they go about you know, handing on humanity as a kind of hendiadys of nature and culture, you know.
Well, that is a great summation of just about everything we've been talking about. So thanks. That was definitely pearls of wisdom there, Adrian, at the end. At the end, there were pearls of wisdom. Pearls of wisdom. Absolutely, absolutely. So I just thank you guys. It's been one of the longest YouTube podcast conversations I've ever done, and that's because I love y'all. And so yeah, this has been great.
Mutual,
yeah. So thanks a lot, guys. I thought it was a wonderful conversation, and let me hit the stop record button so we don't say anything rude just yet.